We're reading from Psalm 15. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose way of life is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, and casts no slurs on others, who stands against the vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. Let's join together in singing 27, As the Deer, and you can remain seated during the singing. From the prophet Micah, chapter 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So, we were in the study group on Tuesday evening, and we were talking about how do we know the will of God in our lives? How do we understand where God is calling us, what God is calling us to do, who God is calling us to be? And we talked a great deal about that, especially within the context of the congregation getting ready to go into the search process in earnest. Because the question comes up is, how do you find out who the right person is to be your next minister? How do you know whether God is directing you towards this person or that person? How do we understand what God's will is for us as a congregation and for us as individuals? Because we're long past those times when, in the Bible that you'll read about stories where voices come out of the heavens indicating this is the right choice. Or a prophet would come along and say, this is who you should be. This is what God is calling you to be. And it was firm and understood, and everybody knew what the will of God was, and there was no question about that. But in this day and age, there's always lots of questions about the will of God and what God is asking of us and who God is calling us to be and who God is calling us to call as a minister. And so we were talking about that quite a bit in the study group. And the one thing that I shared with people was that my feeling was that God does not call us to the specific. God calls us to the general, in the sense that out in the world, in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, there are any number of ministers who would be wonderful and gifted and connective for this congregation. And God doesn't really care which one you call. God doesn't really have a name in mind. It's not as though the search team is going to be out there and God's going to be saying, you want to call Joe Smith. But what about this? No, you want to call Joe Smith. Instead, it's a case of God looking, or the search team looking out and asking themselves, who is it who is going to be the most effective in partnering with us to share the gospel, to live the gospel here within our church and within the wider community? And there's lots of people out there who have those gifts, who have those abilities. And your challenge as a congregation, as a search team, is to find one of those people and to call them into ministry. So it's not a matter of one specific person, it's a matter of finding those people who fit what this congregation needs to move into the future. As I was telling the study group, I had a friend a long time ago who was telling me about his wife and was thanking God for the fact that God had directed him to the love of his life. And that's wonderful, and that's great. But then he told me that she was the only woman in the world who could possibly be his wife. That God had directed him to the only woman in the world who he could love as he loved her. And I thought about that for a few seconds, and then I said to him, well, isn't it surprising that of all the women in the world, and the one person that God has chosen for you to love happened to live 3 doors down from you? It's the same thing with that. You know, I love Lorraine. Lorraine has been a true gift to me, and I am not afraid to say that I believe without a doubt that God called Lorraine into my life. And she's become my wife, and we have shared a life together. But I'm not naive enough to think that there aren't other people out there who are equally wonderful, who I could have had a great life with. And in the same way, there are countless people out there that Lorraine could have loved and had a great life. So how do we know what the will of God is? Well, as I said, it's a case of generalities, not specifics. And so as I shared with the group on Tuesday evening, I actually had a different sermon planned for today. But we got talking about all of this stuff, and the more we talked about it, the more I thought, that's pretty good. I should use that on Sunday morning, and so that's what we're doing. The one thing that I told them, that if I had only one sermon left to preach, if I had only one time that I could come into a congregation and teach them what I considered to be the essentials of the gospel, the one truth that everybody needed to know, that the one truth that would help us to be the most effective, most meaningful, most grace-filled, most loving Christian community we could possibly be, it would be that reading from Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to to walk humbly with God. And the truth is that I could have stood up at the start of this sermon and said to you, if I only had one sermon left to preach, it would be to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God, and then sit down. Because there really is no greater message than that. There really is nothing else that I could say that would make it more meaningful. That to me is what it means to be Christian. That to me, in one form or another, is what every single sermon I have ever preached has been about. To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. Now, of course, the question becomes, well, when you say to do justice, what do we mean by that? Like, to do justice, does that mean that I have to? No. I would say the message is to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. Yeah, but how do I do it when I'm interacting with my neighbor? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. Yeah, but does that mean I have to even love them? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. That is, for me, the reality of the gospel. Now, you might say, coming off of that, well, what about salvation? What about life after death? What about going to heaven? Well, the truth is that I have no idea, other than what faith tells me, other than what Scripture tells me, of what is beyond death. I don't know if we die and that's it. I don't know if we die and we enter into fellowship with God. I don't know if we die and we become part of the cosmos. Everything that I proclaim, everything I believe is based on faith. But I don't know for sure about any of that stuff. And so my one singular meaningful focus then becomes the thing that I do know about. And that is this life. Who we are here and now. And so how do we live the Christian life here and now? How do we embrace salvation in all of its fullness here and now? How do we create the kingdom of heaven here and now? We do justice. We love kindness. We walk humbly with God. Now, I was actually pretty excited earlier this week. I was going to talk when we were saying about doing justice. I was going to talk about some of the really phenomenal movement that had taken place at the Bishops' Council in the Roman Catholic Church this week. You may have heard about the conclave that they've had and the discussions that they've had about the meaning of family and how do they define it. And I was really excited because when I read the initial report that they had put out, they had talked about the fact that even Catholics who had been divorced and had remarried in a civil ceremony should be welcomed to communion, should be welcomed into the full fellowship of the church. And that those who were gay should also be embraced and welcomed for the gifts that they bring, for the spirit of goodness and compassion and grace that they can bring into the life of a congregation. Even though they admitted it was problematic for them, that it would be great if even people who were in gay relationships could be recognized for the love and compassion that they show to their partner. And I was excited about that. I thought, there it is, finally, the Roman Catholic Church and the church in general is beginning to speak with relevance to the world around them. For centuries, and certainly for the last number of decades, the biggest complaint against the church in general, not just Roman Catholics, but the church in general, is the fact that we have been so out of touch with society. That there is so much that we proclaim, so much that we teach, that is really irrelevant to our neighbors. And I thought, finally, here it is, the Roman Catholic Church, probably the most conservative organization in all of the world, making this great proclamation that families would be welcomed and embraced even after divorce, that those who were gay would be welcomed and embraced even though it went against church policy. And I was excited about that. And then last night, before I went to bed, I read the final report. And they chickened out. And they stepped back. And everything that they had written that was powerful and meaningful and connective, they had removed. So close. To do justice. To do justice for us as a people of God means to stand up for those everybody else pushes to the side. It means to take positions that are right and grace-filled and compassionate, even if it goes against the hierarchy of the church. Even though it might go against teachings that are hundreds of years old, if it is right, if it is just, it is worth standing up for. To love kindness, to be compassionate, is essentially what that means. To live out the Spirit of Christ in the relationships that you have. This congregation, as I have told you many times before, does that very well. You are a compassionate people. And if that's all that you achieve as a congregation throughout your existence, it will have been a meaningful ministry indeed. To walk humbly with God. We get the wrong impression about what it means to be humble sometimes, especially within the church. A lot of times when we talk about humility in the church, we talk about it in the sense that we have to bring ourselves down. We have to beat our chests and proclaim we are unworthy. We have to look at ourselves and say, "Oh, Lord, have mercy on me, for I am such a sinner." But that's not what humility is about at all. Humility is not about putting yourself down. It's not about being weak. It's not about always letting somebody else take the lead. Being humble is about recognizing that you can be authentically who you are in relationship with others. That you don't need to put on a mask. You don't need to put on some false front. You don't need to behave in ways you think others want you to behave in order that they will like you. Because the one thing that we do learn from the gospel is that we are the beloved of God. And we're the beloved of God, warts and all. We are the beloved of God whether we are broken or whole, whether we're afraid or courageous, whether we are loving or hateful. We are the beloved of God. And so to be humble with God is to simply be who we are, to be authentically who I am, with all of my strengths and all of my weaknesses. To be authentically who you are, with all of your strengths and all of your weaknesses. That's what it means to walk humbly with God. I will come, I will serve Christ, I will walk alongside God's people, but I will do so as who I am. Not to live up to anybody else's standards, but only to seek to serve God as who I am. If I had only one sermon left to preach, that would be it. Do justice. Love kindness. Walk humbly in partnership with God. Do that, and you need never question whether you are fulfilling the will of God. You need never question whether the choices you are making are the right ones. You need never question whether you are indeed the beloved of the Lord.